That's what set the stage for this crisis. With normal regulation, it could never have occurred. But it did occur, and therefore they were made to pay the price. So there was an election in January in which the right-wing government fell, and unfortunately a social democratic government, dominated government, came in, and the Social Democrats are determined to join the European Union, even though the European Union takes the side of the British and the Dutch. So the idea is join Europe, and in order to get in, you've got to pay $6 billion over a period of several years. So Birgitte Jonsdottir said, look, this country, Iceland, is technically bankrupt. We should stop paying. The IMF and the European Union have been hostile to us. They've been supporting the British and the French in their extortion, because that's really what it is. And this it got a significant amount of attention in the Icelandic press. We're now in the middle of what is likely to become a government crisis in Iceland, because the health minister, a guy that I was also able to talk to, he's from the Left Green Party, and he said, look, I can't go out in public and recommend that we pay. I simply can't, in good conscience, tell my fellow citizens that they should pay the British and the Dutch. And one of the rules for being a minister in the cabinet is you've got to obey the discipline of at least in public, you've got to support the agreed-on policy. So he quit the government about 10 days ago, and it looks like this government is now going to come down. The problem, of course, is what would then follow, early elections or what? And the big question is, are there people who have the intelligence, the brains, and the guts to say, we can't pay, let's do this in an orderly way rather than in some chaotic way. Let's do it now. Let's not dither. Let's not, pay several $1 billion that we could better use here at home. And what I tried to propose also was that if you're going to have a debt moratorium, which they absolutely have to do, you've also got to take other measures for self-defense. You've got to have a Tobin tax of 1% on financial transactions so you drain this derivative swamp. You've got to have a nationalization of the central bank so that the money supply, the interest rates, and the lending categories are determined by public laws and not by cliques of bankers meeting in secret. And then you've got to have an infrastructure program. Now, Iceland is very interesting. It's volcanic, right? Everywhere you go, there are volcanoes. I mean, there are hundreds of volcanoes. The whole place is sitting on a pool of volcanic activity. So there's a lot of geothermal energy, and I visited a very modern geothermal energy plant that was already producing 200 megawatts, which is quite respectable. And there were plans to take it up to 300 megawatts and beyond, except if they try to pay for the IMF, in this case for the British and the Dutch, they won't have the money to get these turbines that they bring in from Mitsubishi and Toshiba in Japan that they absolutely need. The other thing about Iceland that stands out when you visit it is there are no railroads of any kind. There are no trolleys, no streetcars, there's no light rail. There's just no rail system at all. And that means that you get a lot of imported gasoline that you don't really want to have to pay for in a crisis. So they'd be very well advised to start building some fast electric mass transit in the Reykjavik area, probably 3 lines to the airport to surrounding communities. And then what they've never had is a trans-island railway, right? If you look at the great stories of development in world history, Russia, it's the Trans-Siberian Railway, sponsored by the Tsar. In the United States, it's the Transcontinental Railway, started by Lincoln and Henry Carey. What they need is to go across this large, desolate area, the Central Highlands of Iceland, which is pretty much empty at this point. There are no real roads. It would be time to build a road with a rail link across the island and then up to the north. So you'd unite the country, and of course in the process that would be a stimulus. That would be a real infrastructure stimulus to raise the productivity of labor and add to the capital stock of the country. So this is a fascinating story. I mean, this is a microcosm. The main idea that you can learn from this is if you want to have a recovery, you've got to destroy or at least neutralize the masses of fictitious capital which have been created out of nothing by financiers, bankers, hedge fund operators, and so forth, right? The main question in the world is the derivatives, the 1.5 quadrillion of derivatives that were created outside of any production and indeed against production. Right? If you don't get rid of them, they will crush the rest. In the case of Iceland, you've got the British and the Dutch coming and saying, guess what? You owe us $6 billion, half your yearly GDP, and fork over, or we'll embargo you, we'll cut off your bank lending, and so forth. So you got to be ready to fight back. In order to fight back, you've got to mobilize the people. This is no game for reactionaries. In other words, if you want to be an elitist and an oligarch, you can't get into this, because you're going to have to talk to the people, mobilize them, and basically establish an elementary idea of fairness if you're going to have a national struggle against a foreign enemy like the Anglo-Dutch. So I hope they do it. At least they've stepped forward. It's interesting that in the last year or so, people in the Philippines have been talking about debt moratorium for their country. Sri Lanka, Ceylon, the same story. And I'm sure there's a lot more right below the surface, because there are, in particular, UNCTAD, right, the United Nations Commission for Trade and Development. Their Secretary General put out a call a couple of months ago saying that it's time for a debt moratorium for the most heavily indebted countries in the third world. And that means it means a total freeze. It just says that for a certain amount of time, I would recommend for Iceland 15 years or the duration of the world economic depression, whichever lasts longer, you're not going to pay, because you can't pay. Later on, you can look at it, you can negotiate. It's also interesting that in the crisis, Gordon Brown defined Iceland as a terrorist state, because the way he did this operation with the banks, he invoked one of these totalitarian British anti-terror laws that were instituted after 9/11, and he said the Icelanders are threatening the economy of Britain, and therefore under our terrorist law we can shut down their bank, and we're going to demand the money be paid by them. So it's essentially blackmail using threats. In other words, if you don't pay me the money, you're a terrorist, and I'm going to come after you with God knows what. The Icelanders, though, have a tradition of standing up to the British. Back in the 1970s, there were these cod wars about fishing grounds, and the British would not accept the idea that they had to stay out of Icelandic territorial waters, and the British would send warships, and the Icelanders had some patrol boats, and eventually the British lost. They had to cave in. I hope it'll be again this time.
As do I. We'll be back after this. If you're just joining us, it's the Infowarrior with Jason BERMAS on this special Thursday edition. We are joined by Webster Tarpley, and the latest article is Iceland political leader calls for debt moratorium as government crumbles. You can probably go to webstertarpley.com and check that out, or I'll have him give the website out in just a moment. Webster, it seems to me, though, that even if the people do rise up and they do topple the government, really it's only half the battle, like you said. What's going to keep them from being swallowed up by the EU if that does occur?
Well, the polls show that before this crisis, there was essentially a small majority in Iceland, if I remember correctly, in favor of joining the European Union. But the behavior of the European Union, the Commission in Brussels, this guy Barroso, this tin pot dictator from Portugal who runs this thing at the moment, he was so obviously a puppet of the British and the Dutch, in the sense that, of course, Portugal was for a long time a puppet state of the British, used by the British against Spain primarily for several hundred years there.